Hey guys, I am back with part two. All right, so next up, we need to talk about in-text citations in APA style. So in-text citations are, to be perfectly frank, going to be like the hardest thing about this essay. And the chances that you're going to get it right the first time are slim. So don't worry. It's going to take some time and some effort to kind of start to understand how to use in-text citations when you're going back and forth between several sources. And so we're going to I'm going to sort of teach you the basics today, and we're going to look at some examples, and then we'll look at some more examples of more complicated situations next week. So in-text, so it's important to understand like what in-text citations are and why we use them, so that we can kind of figure out when, where, and how to use them. So they are cross-references that point your reader to the appropriate entry in your reference list, right? Remember, that's what APA style calls a bibliography or a works cited page. So they're kind of like they're like links, right? That say, hey reader, this information comes from this source. If you want to, I'm just going to tell you the name of the source and the page number and the date right now. If you want to be able to go look up that source yourself, just flip back to my reference list and you can find the full information there. That is what they say to your reader. So the job of the in-text citation is to clarify which claims come from which parts of which sources. Okay, so every in-text citation in APA style has three parts. So one is the author's name, and here's some kind of technical stuff. You don't necessarily have to remember this. You could just refer back to this either here or at Purdue OWL, you'll find the same information. So the author's name, if there's one or two authors, you list them all. If there's 3 to 5 authors, you list them all the first time and just the first name and et al., which means and more, after that. If there's more than 5 names, you list the first name and et al. Every time, but you list them all in your reference list. Okay. You will never remember that, so just refer back to this. Okay, and when I say name, I mean last name, okay? Remember, in the reference list for APA style, we get the last name and the first initial. But in the in-text citation, we want just the last name. So the name, the date, and the page number for quotations and any paraphrases where knowing the page number would aid the reader. That's literally the APA rule. So that's nice because it's really so not clear. Because I always describe in-text citations as kind of more of an art than a science, and this is exactly why. Because the rules are often not hard and fast, and there are a lot of judgment calls that you have to make. And here is one, right? So look, when I interpret that phrase, right, include the page number where it would aid the reader, that means pretty much always. So, one of our goals of citations is to cover our behinds by making sure that our reader knows as much information about our sources as possible. So I would strongly suggest so you always have to use a page number with quotations. That's not in question. It's paraphrase where it's a question. But I would suggest just use the page number for paraphrases too, whenever possible. With summary, it gets a little more complicated because remember, summary is just kind of like an overall sense of what the source argues, and that sometimes you can't pin down to a page number. But paraphrases are like more specific, right? That's when you're talking about like one specific thing a source says, and in that case, you should usually be able to pin it down to a particular page number. Okay. So those are the components of the in-text citation. So let's talk next about how you incorporate an in-text citation into your sentence. There are two ways to do it. So we're going to talk about the first one too. So the first one first, and I'm going to sort of show some examples and then we'll come around to the second one. So for the first way is to put the author's names into the main part of the sentence with the signal phrase. Remember our old friend, the signal phrase. And then you hang the date off the name with the page number going at the end of the sentence in parentheses. Okay. This is a really useful way to incorporate an in-text citation. Remember, we've talked before about how using a signal phrase can often be the most elegant and kind of upfront way to incorporate a source. And so this is the way you do it with a signal phrase. 2 examples. Claxton Oldfield et al., 2004, specifically looked at motivations, reviewing British and American studies, and carrying out further interviews to compile a list of 22 reasons for volunteering. End of the sentence, page number in parentheses. APA style uses P period before the page number for no apparent reason. They just do. MLA doesn't, but APA does. So notice what happens here. The name is at the beginning, and notice how the date is like, it's really like it's hanging off the name. Wherever you have the name, the date goes right after, okay? So just remember that kind of formula. Second example is the same. Similarly, Panlop and Trost, 2009, also found that motives vary with age. So name, date in parentheses, and then page number at the end of the sentence, also in parentheses. Okay, so while we're looking at these citation styles, I'm going to sort of bring in a sample paragraph that might appear in the body of essay 3. So not like an introduction paragraph or a conclusion, but just a regular old paragraph in the middle of the paper. So we're going to look at citation style, but also think about the structure of this paragraph. Okay. The pervasive phenomenon of interrogational torture can also be attributed to the system of criminal justice that allows it to exist. Most scholars have concluded that the root problem is that China, this is from a paper about interrogational torture of people in prisons in China. Okay. Most scholars have concluded that the root problem is that China fails to separate powers to achieve a fundamental balance in criminal justice among these 3 actors: the public security organs, the people's procurates, and the people's court. As Chen, 2000, observes, Chinese criminal procedure has a streamlined production structure in which courts are plagued by problems of lack of independence and limited authority and powers, so the courts cannot effectively guard against the state abusing its powerful position to prove a case against an individual citizen in order to fulfill its duty of enforcing the criminal law. Okay, so before we talk about citations, let's look at the structure of this paragraph. So note the bun at the very beginning. One thing I want you to notice about the sort of structure of this paragraph is that the bun, that topic sentence at the beginning, doesn't cite any sources. So that's really useful for some kinds of paragraphs. For paragraphs that are going to synthesize, put together multiple sources, okay? And then look at what that paragraph does. We have a most scholars, yada, 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 sentence, which cites 2 specific studies at the end, and then the paragraph moves in depth with 1 source. So we have this long sentence that goes in depth with just 1 source. So that is a really interesting paragraph structure that I think works really well, because it's a paragraph that's very in control of its sources. So it starts with a sentence that isn't all wrapped up in its sources, right? It's more general than that, right? It's containing the whole paragraph, right? And then we move back and forth between sort of a zoomed out view where we're synthesizing sources, where we're putting them together, and zooming in to go more in depth where there's an example that seems useful to consider with a specific source. Okay, so just note this as one possible kind of paragraph construction that will be of use for you in this essay. I would imagine that most of you are going to wind up with a paragraph that looks like this at some point in your paper. So that sentence that went in depth with the 1 source looks quite familiar in terms of its citation strategy, doesn't it? This is our first citation strategy. We have the source's name at the beginning of the sentence, we hang the date right off the name, and then we have the page number in parentheses at the end of the sentence. Okay, so that paragraph also displays to us the second in-text citation strategy, which is where you have a source that you just sort of dump it at the end. Let me go back to the paragraph here. It's the sentence in green, right? Notice how at the end of that sentence we have two. We haven't mentioned any authors' names in the paragraph. And so we have no signal phrases, right? And so at the end of the sentence, what we do is we dump the citation there in the end in parentheses. So we have name, comma, date, and we could have a page number if we were dealing with a paraphrase or a quotation. Notice here we have two sources, and this is what you do when you have two sources that you're citing in the same sentence. You separate them in the citation with a semicolon. Okay, so that's the second citational strategy, where you dump the whole citation at the end of the sentence. So let's consider a couple of things. So in this second kind of citation, notice there's no page numbers. So let's think about why that might be. So remember that I suggested that we want the page number when we have a quotation or a paraphrase. That is to say, when we have the information we're getting from the source appears on a very specific page number. It's a specific claim that they're making in one part of their essay. Whereas if we're dealing with a sort of more zoomed out view of a source, we might not have a page number because we're dealing with kind of just the overall argument. It's a sentence that's summarizing a central point, right? You can't really locate it on one page because it's what the whole source is about. So that's why the zoomed out sentence, the most scholar sentence that talks about two sources, doesn't have page numbers, while the in-depth with one source sentence does have a page number. Okay, one more question to consider. How do you choose between these two strategies? When do you use the first and when do you use the second? So we're going to look at another example to start thinking about that. So here's another sample body paragraph from the same essay. What accounts for the average citizen's indifference to the plight of criminal suspects? First, according to Peerenboom 2004, the basic problem lies in the high tides of crime rates as a result of modernization, the transition to a market economy, and increased social and economic inequality combined with moral crisis, resulting in strong public sentiments for greater punitiveness toward offenders. Indeed, many scholars have noticed that the government's periodic strike-hard campaigns, which are often considered as harsh, arbitrary, and extra-legal, are very popular with the public. Citation at the end. Not surprisingly, here we see that the government has been all too willing to respond to the public demand for a war on crime. Let's look at the structure. So notice we have a top bun and a bottom bun with this one. And notice how we can kind of tell that these are the buns in part because there's no citations in the buns. Because the bun is operating on like a different level, right? The bun is holding everything together. So unless the entire paragraph is about one source, you're probably not going to have a citation in your bun. Then notice, again, this paragraph is also going back and forth between zoomed in and zoomed out views of sources, just in a different order. First, we get a sentence with lots of information about one source, and then we get kind of an overview of claims made by two other sources. So it's the same structure as the previous paragraph, just flipped. So let's think about, so one thing we should notice here is that whenever we're going in depth with one source, this writer is choosing the first citational strategy. They're choosing to use a signal phrase. And whenever they're synthesizing multiple sources into a single sentence, whenever they're giving us that zoomed out view, they're choosing the second strategy. That is to say, they put the citations at the end of the sentence. So we have kind of a good sort of rule here. Get the author's names into the main text of the sentence, especially when you're going into depth about one source. So use the signal phrase then. Stick the citations in parentheses at the end when you're talking in a zoomed out way about multiple sources, and what you're trying to do is to synthesize those sources, to put them together for your reader. Okay, over and out on part 2.